What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I am so excited about today's episode because I think this is going to be an absolute game changer for a lot of you that don't like to have compost piles, can't have compost piles, or just don't like taking the effort of cleaning out your beds, dragging your stuff off to a different part of your yard, then bringing it back once it's composted back to the garden and moving things around twice. I'm someone that does not like working harder than I have to, and I'm constantly reminded of this century-old composting method every single time Thanksgiving rolls around. Thanksgiving is not too far away. I don't know how far exactly because I don't have a calendar in front of me, but it's pretty close. And I think it's maybe about 2.5, 3 weeks away or so. And every single time Thanksgiving rolls around, I'm reminded of this method because it was actually a method that the Native Americans taught the Pilgrims that were living in that area how to re-amend their soil. This is something that we actually learned. I learned in 5th grade in a history book, and I actually am able to use it today. And I love that I can actually reference stuff that I've learned from the past, from a long time ago, that at the time I thought was completely pointless and not necessary at all. We actually are using it again. And it was actually because we were talking about, it was actually a environmental science class, and we were talking around Thanksgiving how the Pilgrims were taught to amend their soil. We were going through the different methods that were taught to them, such as putting a fish underneath their corn plants, or this method that I'm going to talk about, which is trench composting. And so there was a bunch of different methods that they talked about, using seaweed from the nearby ocean to put around their plants and stuff like that. Indians have been doing that for thousands of years and taught the Pilgrims how to do that so that they could have food security and survive the winter. And I think that's just so incredible and such an awesome story, especially around Thanksgiving when we're being thankful. And that's kind of the original reason why we celebrate Thanksgiving. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of the Thanksgiving story of composting. So how do we do what the Indians taught the Pilgrims? It's very simple. And why I love this method so much, and why it actually is probably going to be one of my preferred methods of composting in the fall time, is because it's so simple and it's as close to a closed loop system of composting as you can get. Where I'm getting at is this bed right here had squash, it had beans, and it had it still has some rosemary and stuff in this bed. This bed has pak choi, peas, radishes, rutabaga, things like that. They're still growing. I'm not going to pull those out yet. But every single bed that has dead plants in it, those plants all had specific nutrient requirements to grow. The bed behind us had sunflowers and okra. The bed over there had peppers. Every single plant has different nutrient requirements and different nutrient uptakes. And what that does is it creates imbalances in the garden. And what the Indians found is that when you took these plants that were dead, their reasoning for doing so is that the different nutrients would actually be given back to the bed that it was taken from. This is a fascinating concept and something that, as gardeners, we struggle with all the time, where you plant a really heavy nitrogen feeder right here, right? And that nitrogen, like let's say it's corn. Corn is one of the heaviest nitrogen feeders of them all. Okay, so we talk about how then the next time we have to rotate our crops. Well, what the Indians found is that they did not necessarily have to rotate their crops if they turned the corn into compost right where the corn was grown, because most of the nutrients that were taken out were given back to that exact area. Now, crop rotations were done for disease and pest resistance and kind of overall area health. But what they found is that nutrients were not depleted as fast if you composted right in the exact location you grew the plants. This is an absolute mind-blowing concept, and I'm so excited about it because it makes so much sense. If you were to take corn here, compost it, and then put it over in that bed, the compost is kind of mixed up. It's all homogeneous. It all becomes compost at the end of the day. But each thing has a different nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium ratio. When you compost down leaves, they might have a NPK of like 1.5, right, for your NPK. But if you break down and compost corn stalks, the NPK is more like 3, 1, 2. They have much higher nitrogen and much higher potassium in relationship to leaves. And so if you take that compost and move it over somewhere else, you're always having this imbalance where this bed had a lot of nitrogen taken out of it, but not a lot of nitrogen is being given back to it. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out all of these plants and just set them aside. Almost done. Now I know you guys are gonna ask this, Luke, isn't this really similar to core gardening? And the answer is yes, very good observation. This is very similar to core gardening, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's some type of correlation there. So yeah, this is basically core gardening with plants that were left over from the growing season, essentially. Instead of using leaves or straw or grass clippings, things like that to make your core, this is just going to be plants left over. Now they will be broken down completely by spring. So they will have actually completely decomposed and there won't be much core there. So you'll probably have to come back in the spring if you're using core gardening. If you're using the core gardening method, you'll probably have to come back in the spring to put the straw back in the core. But you at least will have really good fertile soil where your plants were decomposing. I never like taking off pole beans off their trellis because it is difficult to say the least. They're all wrapped up and you only get little, if there's an easy way to get pole beans off their trellis, let me know. I've never quite found one. You just gotta kind of pull and untangle and just kind of get what you can get. But you eventually get it cleaned up, it just takes a while. Now there's one point that I just cannot get away from, which is why I love this method so much, and I constantly gravitate towards it, and that's that this method actually emulates a closed loop system as close as possible. You know, as gardeners, we always strive for a closed loop system or as closed of a loop as possible because it reduces your inputs and your cost as well as your impact. So a lot of times we talk about a closed loop versus an open loop system. And if you don't know what that is, a closed loop is basically that there are no external inputs. Everything that is on the property is used to grow a garden, and then all the waste and all the refuse goes back into basically re-amending and re-fertilizing to regrow crops. Everything is cyclical. And usually this is done with like animals. You know, you'll feed the food scraps to animals. The animals will create, the animals might create meat or eggs for you or milk. And then, you know, their manure also creates fertilizer. And so you have this closed loop system where you have fertilizer, you have food, everything is kind of being contained within one area. And when it becomes an open loop is when you have to bring in, let's say, animal feed to feed the animals, but you get manure to feed your garden. You know, that's not really a closed loop. You're bringing in a resource. But with an organic garden and, you know, not a homestead, you know, we don't have a homestead that has chickens or goats or horses, which we'd love all of those. We just don't have those yet. You know, in a garden, you can also have an open and a closed loop system. Composting is a way to kind of close that loop. Because if you're bringing bagged soil or potting soil back into your garden in the spring, you're actually buying that. That's an external source of material. And so that actually causes people to, you know, there's trucks that are involved with trucking that in. There is, you know, there is machinery that is used to harvest that soil and process that soil. There's, you know, there's your money that is involved in spending money. There's gas to go get it from the store. It's just, there's a whole lot of other things that add to the footprint and the cost of a garden. But a closed loop can actually help you save money and reduce that footprint all in the same time. All right, now all I'm going to do is just dig a trench right in the center of the bed here. I'm just going to dig a trench that's about, oh, 8 inches deep or so, 10 inches deep. No need to really worry about depth. It's just, you want it buried deep enough to where it can really break down quickly. The closer it is to the surface, the more slowly it'll take to break down, because a lot of the bacteria and fungi, they actually survive the winter under the soil. That's why when you add a mulch layer to your beds, which we'll be doing with leaves later on in the year, when you add a mulch layer, it helps to insulate the soil so that the bacteria and fungi can survive through more of the soil column. If the soil is not protected, you'll actually have a lot of the bacteria and fungi that will that will kind of leave that top 1 to 2 inches of soil, or will completely go dormant to where they are no longer active. And then obviously they'll be active in the spring. But if you want things to continue breaking down throughout winter, you got to bury it deep enough to where the cold weather does not affect it immediately. All right, now that we've got our trench, all we're going to do is just fill it with our material. Just like that. Get your squash plants, your bean plants, all that good stuff. Throw it all in there, and that'll all break down before spring. And then the last thing we have to do is just cover it up. Cover it up with the soil that we took from the trench, and that's going to be about 2 to 3 inch layer. Once you put that soil back, there you go. Now you'll probably notice through doing this that I have greatly increased the amount of soil, or the appearance of soil, in my beds. And that's because I have all of this volume, all of this organic matter is now going to become the soil, and my beds are now probably 10%, 25% more full than they were when I began. That means that I have less soil to amend in the spring, and there's more nutrients in the bed than there would have been. So there you go. There is a century-old composting technique that I hope you all will try in your garden to help you grow bigger, go home, and work smarter instead of harder. If you did enjoy and you learned something new, make sure to throw a like up there and comment down below with something that you learned. If you've been using this method before, let me know as well. I think it's really cool when we share the experiences that we've had if we've been using these methods to let others know how they've worked for you. And also, I really do hope that you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving season. I always like to say that if you're thankful for one day out of the year, then that's okay. But I want to see you guys being thankful for every day of the year. Every single day has its challenges, but every single day has something to be thankful for. And focus on those things that you're thankful for, and your life is so much better. Your life is so much more bright and exciting. And I'm always thankful for something. So I'm thankful today for you for tuning in for today's episode. And as always, we'll catch you all on the next episode. Grow bigger, go home. Bye.